Got one of those annoying friends who thinks he knows everything? Here's a riddle from history for him that stumps pretty much everyone. What's the difference between a pilgrim and a Puritan? If you don't know the answer yourself, cut yourself some slack. You've got plenty of company. I mean, who doesn't mix up the Pilgrims and the Puritans? In the history books, they look just the same, with the big black hats and buckled shoes. They were both big churchgoers who said thee and thou a lot, and both were somber, serious types, not much into fun. But where did they come from? Why did they come to America? And most importantly, how do you tell them apart? Stick with me for the next 5 minutes, and you'll never mistake a Pilgrim for a Puritan again. Let's start in Massachusetts. That's where almost all of the Pilgrims and Puritans in America lived. The Pilgrims came there first, in 1620, aboard a ship you've probably heard of, the Mayflower. A year after they arrived, they had a harvest feast with the local native people that we remember as the first Thanksgiving. The Puritans arrived almost 10 years later, in 1630. A lot of them. More than 1,000 Puritans in a fleet of 17 ships. They settled farther north. Within a decade, the population of their colony grew to over 20,000, outnumbering Plymouth nearly 10 to 1. The big event we remember them for? The Salem witch trials. But to understand why the Puritans and Pilgrims came to America and how they got the names we call them, we have to turn back the clock and head back across the Atlantic Ocean. Both groups came from England. And if we wind the calendar back to around 1600, there were no Pilgrims or Puritans. At that time, they were both part of a much larger group called the Anglicans. Anglican is Latin for English. If you were an English subject, you were an Anglican. And by law, from the moment you were born, you were a member of the Anglican Church, the national church of England. The Anglican Church was more than a place to worship. It was a rich and powerful institution led by the royal monarch and governed by a legion of religious officials. It dominated the lives of the English people. Most of England's 4 million Anglicans were content with the English Church the way it was. But some weren't, not by a long shot. These dissatisfied people believed that the church's worship services were too elaborate and ceremonial. They didn't like how praying during worship followed a scripted formula instead of allowing worshipers to pray as they pleased. They didn't like that the king and his bishops controlled the church. They didn't like a long list of things about the Anglican Church, and they made it their mission to make it simpler and more like what they believed the Bible said it should be. These reformers became known as the Puritans. Their identity is in their very name, because they wanted to purify the Church of England from within. But this is when the story takes a cool left turn. A minority of reformers came to realize that purifying the church wasn't the answer. They believed that it had strayed so far from Christ's teachings that they had to break away and form their own church. These rogue reformers were, you guessed it, the Pilgrims. Except no one called them Pilgrims then. In their day, they were called Separatists, because they separated from England's national church. The key thing to remember is that the Pilgrims were once Puritans, but left their ranks to pursue their own separate vision of what they believed to be the true Christian faith. But pursuing that dream was dangerous. Breaking away from the Anglican Church was illegal. Church and state were one in England. Anyone refusing to be a part of the church wasn't just a lawbreaker, but a traitor. To protect themselves, the Pilgrims set up a network of secret churches in the countryside, but they paid a heavy price. The Pilgrims were fugitives in their own land, and those who were caught faced persecution, imprisonment, and even death. By 1607, the Pilgrims realized that they'd have to leave England if they wanted to survive. And that's when they hopped aboard the Mayflower and came to America, right? Not quite. First, they sailed to the more religiously tolerant country of Holland. Over the next 13 years, their new church grew, but many of the Pilgrims became unhappy. The only jobs they could find were low-paying and backbreaking. And their children were becoming more Dutch than English.
Good morning, son.
Goedemorgen.
So in 1620, the Pilgrims decided that the only answer was to separate even further and establish their own colony in America. But what about the Puritans? What have they been doing all this time? They've been busy working for change within the Anglican Church, trying to purge it from what they believed were its many excesses and abuses. But by 1630, no change had happened, so the Puritans decided to follow the Pilgrims to Massachusetts. Unlike the Pilgrims, however, they declared they were loyal Anglicans. They just felt better with an ocean between them and the Church of England. Now we're back to where we started, with the Pilgrims in Plymouth and the Puritans to the north, near present-day Boston. And now that we can tell which from which, you might be asking, whatever became of them all? By 1692, the Puritan colony became so big and influential that it absorbed tiny Plymouth and the Pilgrims. And over the next centuries, the Puritans stopped calling themselves Puritans, renaming themselves Congregationalists, and their distinctive culture gradually faded. Now, 400 years after their arrival, the Pilgrims and the Puritans have melded and congealed in our national memory. But both played distinctive roles in America's origin story, and are woven deeply into our cultural DNA.